I think the one I enjoyed reading more than anything else was Harry Potter.
They told us the crown hides secrets, but no one imagined this. Some photographs capture beauty, while others capture truth. But this was never meant for the public eye. For 3 long years, it lay buried in a guarded palace archive, sealed under strict orders, protected by silence and fear. The man behind the camera, a royal photographer with over 30 years of service, carried the weight of that moment like a stone on his chest. What he saw through his lens that day was not the polished grace the world associates with Queen Camilla. It was raw, unguarded, damning. For years, loyalty kept him quiet. But now his conscience has spoken. The photograph is about to break free, and when it does, it could shatter Camilla's carefully built image in an instant. Stay with us, because once you see what the palace tried to hide, you will never look at the queen consort the same way again. The photographer's dilemma. Marcus Whitmore was not just any royal photographer. For 30 years, he had stood behind the lens at moments both historic and intimate, trusted to capture the image of the monarchy at its best. From state banquets glittering under chandeliers to quiet garden gatherings shielded from the public eye, Marcus had been there. His work was not only about skill, but about trust. A trust that had been earned over decades of absolute discretion. The palace knew he was a man who could keep secrets, but they also knew he was a man who valued truth. Over the years, Marcus had seen the royals as few ever would. He knew the subtle smiles exchanged between William and Catherine when the cameras were not supposed to notice. He had caught the glances of pride in the Queen's eyes during a simple handshake with a schoolchild. He had also witnessed moments of tension that never made the front pages, disagreements behind closed doors that faded into polite unity before the public could see. His career had been built on balancing loyalty to the crown with an artist's pursuit of authenticity. But one day, that balance was tested in a way he could never have anticipated. It happened during what should have been a routine assignment, the official portrait session for Queen Camilla as the newly crowned consort. The room was bright with professional lighting. Assistants moved swiftly in the background, and Marcus worked with his usual quiet focus. Then, in a moment between poses, the atmosphere shifted. Catherine had stepped into the room briefly, offering a courteous nod before moving toward the exit. What Marcus saw next froze him in place. Camilla, believing herself unobserved, mimicked Catherine's recent health struggles with exaggerated movements and a mocking expression. The assistants stifled uncomfortable smiles, unsure how to react. The cruelty of the gesture was so startling, so out of place in the regal setting, that Marcus's instinct as a photographer took over. Without thinking, he clicked the shutter. When he saw the image later, his stomach tightened. It was not just a bad moment or an unflattering angle. It was a glimpse into character, one that clashed violently with the warm, benevolent image carefully presented to the public. Marcus knew the photograph would never pass through the palace's strict approval process. And he was right. When the session ended and the images were reviewed, palace officials immediately flagged the frame and ordered it destroyed. That night, Marcus could not sleep. For 30 years, he had kept the monarchy's unspoken rule: protect the image at all costs. But this was different. This was not a harmless slip or a private irritation. It was a calculated cruelty, and he could not decide if his duty was to the crown or to the truth. For the next 3 years, that single photograph would haunt him, whispering a question he could not answer. How long can a man protect a secret that could change everything? The forbidden photo session, the official portrait session for Queen Camilla, was intended to be one of the most polished and carefully controlled events in the palace's calendar. The setting had been chosen weeks in advance, a grand yet intimate room lined with gilded mirrors and soft cream drapery. Fresh flowers from the royal gardens filled the air with a subtle fragrance, and every piece of furniture had been positioned to frame the perfect image. The lighting crew worked quietly, adjusting their equipment to create a warm glow that would flatter every detail. On the surface, it was a scene of elegance and calm. Marcus Whitmore moved through the room with the quiet assurance of a man who had done this countless times before. His camera was an extension of himself, every adjustment of the lens made with practiced precision. Assistants moved in and out, smoothing the folds of Camilla's gown, retouching her hair, and ensuring her crown caught the light just right. The queen consort held her pose with regal confidence, offering the subtle smile that had been rehearsed for years. Every detail spoke of a woman in full command of her public image. But it was in the moments between takes that the polished facade slipped. During a brief pause, an aide approached with a quiet update that Catherine had been delayed due to her health recovery schedule. Camilla's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The poised smile faded, replaced by something sharper, more dismissive. She turned slightly away from the main camera, her voice lowering to a tone that carried a hint of mockery. With deliberate exaggeration, she mimicked Catherine's movements, bending her posture and feigning a labored breath in a way that drew uncomfortable glances from those nearby. The room fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the faint click of Marcus's camera. He had been trained to stop shooting the moment a royal stepped out of their official pose, but instinct overpowered protocol. The lens stayed fixed, capturing the fleeting expressions and gestures that no one outside the room was ever meant to see. Each frame froze an unguarded moment, a stark contrast to the dignified image the palace had worked so hard to project. Marcus felt his heartbeat quicken as the shutter continued. He knew the consequences of what he was doing. The palace approval process was meticulous, and any image deemed unflattering or inappropriate would be immediately destroyed. Yet he could not bring himself to lower the camera. Something about the scene felt significant, a glimpse of truth breaking through the layers of ceremony. When the session resumed, Camilla's warm smile returned as if nothing had happened. The crown was adjusted, the lighting fine-tuned, and the final portraits glowed with the image of a gracious queen consort. But Marcus knew that buried among the hundreds of frames taken that day was a sequence the public was never meant to see. It was the beginning of a secret that would grow heavier with each passing day, a forbidden moment captured in silence yet echoing with the weight of what it revealed. The shocking discovery. The photograph sat buried deep within Marcus Whitmore's archives, hidden among hundreds of approved images from the official portrait session. For weeks after the shoot, he avoided looking at it, telling himself it was safer to leave it untouched. But curiosity and conscience are persistent forces. And one evening, alone in his small home office, Marcus opened the file. As the image filled his screen, he felt a knot tighten in his chest. It was not simply unflattering. It was devastating. The frame had frozen a moment so precise that it seemed to carry sound, weight, and intent. Camilla stood with her shoulders hunched, her posture deliberately distorted to mimic Catherine's slow and careful movements during her recovery from illness. Her mouth was twisted in a smirk that fell somewhere between amusement and disdain. The glint in her eyes was not one of playful jest, but of something colder, something rooted in mockery. The detail was undeniable. Her hand was placed over her chest in an exaggerated imitation of a gesture Catherine had been seen making during recent public appearances, when managing her energy and steadying her breath. The slight tilt of her head mirrored Catherine's manner when listening intently to someone speak, but here it was exaggerated to the point of caricature. It was a cruel theater, performed in a room full of staff who knew better than to laugh but also feared interrupting. Marcus stared at the photograph for a long time, every second amplifying the weight of what it revealed. He thought of Catherine's composure in public, her deliberate choice never to complain despite the scrutiny she faced, and her continued service even during her recovery. He remembered the crowds cheering for her at events, unaware of the quiet struggles behind her radiant smile. And here was the queen consort, mocking those very struggles in a way that stripped away all pretense of empathy. He zoomed in on the image, studying each element as if to be certain he was not imagining the intent. The slight narrowing of the eyes, the curling of the lip, the arch of the brow, It all came together into a performance that could not be mistaken for anything other than derision. There was no kindness here, no misunderstanding, no accidental expression. It was a calculated gesture meant to belittle. In that moment, Marcus understood why the palace had been so quick to demand the image's destruction. It was not merely damaging to Camilla's public image. It was a direct threat to the narrative of unity and respect the monarchy worked so hard to maintain. The photograph undermined not only her position as queen consort, but the credibility of the institution she represented. Closing his laptop, Marcus felt the familiar churn of conflict. He had been the keeper of royal secrets for 3 decades, a guardian of moments the public would never see. But this was different. This was not a harmless slip of etiquette or an awkward angle. This was character revealed in its most unguarded form. And once seen, it could never be unseen. The Coverup Campaign. The reaction from the palace was swift and absolute. Within hours of the portrait session ending, Marcus Whitmore received a discreet but urgent summons to meet with 2 senior officials in one of the palace's private conference rooms. The setting was deliberately calm, the polished wood table gleaming under the soft light. But the atmosphere carried a weight that made every word feel deliberate. They began with polite gratitude for his decades of service, praising his professionalism and the beauty of his approved images. Then the conversation shifted. The officials told Marcus that there was one frame from the session that could never be released under any circumstances. They referred to it only as the compromised image, avoiding any direct description. Yet it was clear they knew exactly what had been captured. Without raising their voices, they explained that the image had the potential to cause irreversible reputational damage to the queen consort, and by extension, to the monarchy itself. Marcus was instructed to delete it immediately from his records. When Marcus hesitated, the tone of the meeting subtly changed. They spoke of the legal agreements he had signed over the years, the strict clauses in his contracts about intellectual property belonging to the crown, and the severe consequences of breaching those terms. Then came the incentives. A quiet mention of a substantial increase in his annual retainer, a promise of exclusive assignments, and even the suggestion of a royal honor if he complied without delay. But Marcus could not shake the image from his mind. He had seen unguarded moments before, moments that might have caused embarrassment if released. Yet this was different. This was not a slip of protocol or a human mistake. It was something that revealed character in a way no public relations campaign could repair. In the days that followed, the pressure intensified. A legal letter arrived at his home, heavy with formal language and warning of severe penalties for retaining sensitive material. An anonymous phone call late one evening made it clear that the palace knew where his family lived, though the voice insisted this was merely a reminder of the importance of discretion. The unspoken threat lingered in his thoughts long after the line went dead. Marcus decided then that he could not destroy the photograph, even if it meant risking everything. Under the cover of night, he made a series of encrypted backups, storing them on drives hidden in places only he would know. One copy was placed in a safety deposit box registered under a friend's name, another sent to a secure cloud service with no obvious link to him. Each step was taken with meticulous care, as though he were handling something both priceless and dangerous. The palace believed the image was gone, erased from existence. They moved forward with the approved portraits, flooding the press with images of grace and dignity. But Marcus knew the truth was still out there, preserved in silence, waiting for the day when it would no longer be possible to keep it hidden. And in that knowledge, he understood that the real power was no longer in the palace's hands, but in his. The weight of silence. For 3 long years, Marcus Whitmore carried the weight of a truth that could alter the public's perception of the monarchy forever. Every time he saw Queen Camilla's image in the papers or watched her speaking warmly at charity events, a quiet storm raged within him. To the public, she was a figure of elegance, compassion, and steady support for the king. To Marcus, she was also the woman caught in a single frame that revealed a side the world had never seen. It was a side marked by mockery and cruelty, and he alone possessed the proof. The photograph haunted him. It was never far from his thoughts, whether he was on assignment or at home. At family dinners, he found himself distracted, replaying the moment in his mind. His wife noticed the way his mood would shift whenever the queen consort appeared on television. His teenage son once asked why he always changed the channel during royal coverage. Marcus would only smile faintly and say he had seen enough of that world for one lifetime. The palace had made certain that his silence was not left to chance. A few months after the portrait session, his wife received a letter with no return address. It contained nothing more than a photograph of their home and a typed message reminding them of the importance of protecting the royal image. It was signed with no name, but its meaning was clear. Another time, his daughter came home from school unsettled, saying that a man in a suit had asked if she was the photographer's child. Marcus's blood ran cold, though he tried to reassure her. These incidents were calculated, subtle enough to deny, yet potent enough to keep fear alive. They were reminders that the palace's reach was long and that breaking his silence could have consequences beyond his own career. For a time, this fear worked. He convinced himself that speaking out would do more harm than good, that the world would not believe him, and that perhaps it was better to let the matter fade. But the weight grew heavier with every passing year. Marcus began to see the photograph as more than a frozen moment. It was a symbol of everything false about the carefully crafted narrative surrounding the queen consort. The turning point came when he attended a royal engagement to photograph Catherine at a hospital charity. He watched her speak gently with patients, many of whom were recovering from serious illnesses, and saw the genuine compassion in her eyes. In that moment, the contrast between Catherine's sincerity and Camilla's private cruelty became unbearable. Marcus knew then that his silence was no longer an act of loyalty. It had become complicity. That realization was the breaking point. The fear that had bound him began to loosen, replaced by a conviction that the truth had to be told, no matter the cost. The photograph had survived the palace's attempts to destroy it, but it had also survived the years inside his conscience. Now it was time for it to see the light of day, the public revelation. When Marcus Whitmore finally decided to speak, he knew there would be no turning back. The interview was arranged in complete secrecy with a respected investigative journalist known for refusing to bow to political or royal pressure. They met in a discreet studio on the outskirts of London, far from the grandeur of palace walls. Marcus arrived with a small leather portfolio, worn from years of handling. Inside was the photograph that had weighed on his conscience for so long. The cameras began to roll, and Marcus told his story with the calm precision of a man who had spent his life observing rather than performing. He spoke of his decades behind the lens, of the trust placed in him, and of the day that trust was tested in a way he could never forget. He described the portrait session, the mocking imitation, and the moment he chose to press the shutter instead of lowering his camera. When the photograph was shown on screen for the first time, the room seemed to hold its breath. It was not blurry, not ambiguous, and not open to misinterpretation. It was clear, detailed, and devastating. Camilla's posture, her expression, the exaggerated movements, they told a story no words could soften. The journalist sat in silence, knowing the image spoke for itself. Within hours of the interview's release, the photograph had spread across every major news outlet. Newspapers ran it on their front pages with headlines that asked if the Queen Consort's public image had been a facade all along. Television anchors discussed the story with measured tones, aware of the sensitivity but unable to ignore its impact. By evening, it had reached every corner of the internet. Social media was merciless. Hashtags calling for accountability trended within minutes. Side-by-side comparisons of Catherine's public appearances and the mocking image flooded timelines. Public opinion shifted rapidly, with many expressing outrage that such cruelty could exist behind the polished veneer of royal life. Memes appeared, Commentary videos multiplied and forums dissected every detail of the image. The cruelty captured in that single frame became a symbol for a wider conversation about authenticity, privilege, and the responsibilities of those in public service. For Marcus, the reaction was overwhelming. His inbox was flooded with messages, some praising his courage, others condemning him for breaking decades of loyalty to the crown. His phone rang constantly with media requests, but he declined most of them, choosing to let the photograph speak for itself. He knew there would be consequences, yet for the first time in years, he felt an unexpected sense of relief. In the palace, the mood was one of disbelief and contained panic. What had once been buried was now a global headline, and there was no erasing it from public memory. The photograph had escaped the palace's control and entered the court of public opinion, where judgment was swift and unforgiving. The truth, once hidden in the shadows, now stood in the open for the world to see, and the world would not soon forget it. The royal response. The moment the photograph began dominating headlines, the palace moved into crisis mode. In the communications wing, phones rang without pause as aides scrambled to coordinate a strategy. Statements were drafted and redrafted, each word weighed for its ability to deny without sounding dismissive, to reassure without confirming the authenticity of the image. The first official release was measured, insisting that the photograph had been taken out of context and did not represent the Queen Consort's true nature. It spoke of her long years of charitable service and her unwavering dedication to the monarchy, but it did not directly address the act captured in the frame. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere was tense. Advisors debated whether a public apology might soften the backlash, but others argued that any admission would cement the image in history as undeniable truth. Meetings ran late into the night, with senior courtiers warning that public trust was being eroded faster than the palace could respond. The strategy eventually settled on subtle discrediting. Sources close to the Queen Consort began suggesting that the photograph had been altered or taken during a moment of jest misunderstood by those outside the room. In the midst of this, King Charles found himself at the center of an impossible choice. As a husband, his instinct was to defend Camilla, to protect her from the growing storm. As a monarch, his duty was to uphold the integrity of the crown, which depended heavily on public confidence. Those close to him described him as withdrawn during these days, spending long hours in his private study, reading the growing number of letters from citizens expressing disappointment and disillusionment. William and Catherine, meanwhile, chose a path of quiet dignity. They made no public statements, offered no comments to the press, and refused to be drawn into speculation. Instead, they continued their scheduled engagements with the same composure they had always shown. At a children's hospice event just days after the story broke, Catherine's calm presence and warm interactions with patients stood in stark contrast to the headlines swirling around her family. Photographs of her smiling beside a young patient in a wheelchair spread across the media, not as part of a calculated response, but as a natural reflection of her character. Observers noted that William's silence was just as pointed. His decision not to defend or condemn spoke volumes. In the eyes of many, it was a silent acknowledgement that the photograph required no verbal judgment, that the image itself had already spoken. His steadfast support of Catherine, seen in the way he remained close to her during appearances, was read by the public as an unspoken statement of solidarity. Inside the palace, the divide deepened. While some hoped the storm would pass, others feared the damage was permanent. The royal response had been crafted to contain the fire, but outside the palace gates, the flames continued to spread. And with William and Catherine holding their silence, the weight of that image seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. The unraveling. The release of Marcus Whitmore's photograph had been like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of truth outward. At first, the palace managed to hold the line, clinging to its narrative of misunderstanding and manipulation. But the silence from William and Catherine, coupled with the photograph's undeniable clarity, gave others the courage to speak. The first was a former footman who had served in the royal household for over a decade. He contacted the same journalist who had interviewed Marcus, offering his own account of private moments when the Queen Consort's behavior behind closed doors sharply contrasted with her public image. Soon after, more voices emerged. A retired press aide recounted instances where jokes made at Catherine's expense were met with laughter in private gatherings. A former events coordinator spoke of carefully managing seating arrangements to avoid tense encounters between the two women. Each testimony added weight to Marcus's claims, chipping away at the carefully constructed persona that had been polished for years. Then came the second wave of evidence. Photographs and short video clips began to surface, each captured discreetly during official and private events. One image showed Camilla rolling her eyes during a speech by Catherine at a charity gala. Another, a grainy clip from a staff member's phone, caught her muttering something under her breath as Catherine passed, prompting an uncomfortable chuckle from those nearby. Though none carried the same impact as Marcus's photograph, together they formed a pattern too consistent to ignore. The public, already skeptical after the initial revelation, now saw a troubling mosaic of behavior. Newspapers ran headlines suggesting a deeper rift within the family than previously admitted. Talk shows debated the future of the Queen Consort's role, with some commentators openly questioning whether her continued presence in public duties was sustainable. Social media became a forum for amateur investigators, with thousands of users compiling timelines, comparing images, and drawing connections between the stories now being told. Inside the palace, the atmosphere shifted from defensive to fractured. The Queen Consort's closest allies grew fewer as senior staff distanced themselves from the controversy. Invitations that once flowed freely began to dwindle. At public engagements, the crowds that had once smiled warmly now offered only polite applause, their enthusiasm noticeably muted. The change was subtle but impossible to miss for those who lived within the walls of the royal estate. The mask, once perfectly fitted, had begun to slip. Each new account, each emerging image pulled it further away, revealing a version of the Queen Consort that the public had not been meant to see. The charm and composure that had carried her through decades of public life seemed less convincing under the weight of accumulating truth. By the close of the year, the Queen Consort's approval ratings had fallen to their lowest in memory. It was no longer just about one photograph or one photographer's claims. It was about a growing chorus of voices and images that, together, told a story impossible to silence. The unraveling had begun, and there would be no turning it back. The price of truth. By the time winter settled over London, the consequences of Marcus Whitmore's decision were fully visible. What had begun as whispers and speculation had hardened into public consensus. Poll after poll showed the Queen Consort's approval ratings plunging to unprecedented lows. Even among loyal monarchists, there was a growing discomfort that could no longer be ignored. For years, her public image had been the result of careful strategy and relentless public relations work. Now, in the space of a few months, it had unraveled completely. The shift in public mood was not only reflected in numbers, but in the tone of her appearances. Crowds that once offered warm applause now greeted her with a cool, polite reserve. The energy had changed. At engagements, people were more likely to watch passively than to step forward for a handshake or smile. The warmth she had worked so hard to cultivate was gone, replaced by a quiet scrutiny that followed her every move. It was within this climate that the decision was made. Though no official announcement ever admitted it outright, the Queen Consort began quietly withdrawing from her schedule. Engagements were reassigned to other senior royals. Speeches that had been planned for months were suddenly cancelled without explanation. On paper, she was said to be focusing on personal matters and supporting the king privately, but those close to the palace knew the truth. Her presence had become a liability, and the only way to stop the bleeding was to remove her from the public stage. For Marcus, The reality of what his photograph had set in motion was both sobering and surreal. He had not acted out of malice or ambition. He had acted because he believed the truth mattered, even when it came at a cost. Yet the magnitude of that cost was something he could never have anticipated. His career as a royal photographer was over, but the image he had captured had already taken on a life of its own. It had shifted the conversation about transparency within the monarchy, forcing the public to confront the difference between presentation and reality. In the months that followed, royal watchers began to note subtle changes in how the family operated. There was a greater caution in official communications, a more deliberate effort to ensure that public statements matched private actions. The lesson was clear. In an age where one image can cross the world in seconds, authenticity is no longer optional. Marcus often reflected on that truth. He had spent decades perfecting the art of protecting the crown's image, yet it was the one moment he allowed the unvarnished truth to escape that would define his legacy. The Queen Consort's absence from public life was a direct result of that choice. And though the palace would never acknowledge it, one man's conscience had changed the monarchy forever. The price of truth had been high, but its impact was undeniable. In the digital age, a single image can speak louder than 1,000 carefully crafted statements. Marcus Whitmore's photograph proved that truth, once captured, has a way of outlasting the most powerful institutions. It reminded the world that behind the polished speeches and perfectly staged appearances, authentic character will always find its way to the surface. You can hide it for a time. You can shape the narrative. But the lens sees everything. This moment in royal history was not just about one act of cruelty or one photograph. It was about the shift it sparked, a demand for greater transparency, a call for accountability, and a reminder that even the most established traditions must adapt to the expectations of a watchful public. For the monarchy, the lesson is clear. Public trust is not built solely on ceremony. It is built on the consistency between private actions and public words. For the rest of us, it is a reminder that integrity matters most when no one is watching, because someone always is. If you want to follow more stories that pull back the curtain on power, privilege, and the truths that change history, make sure to subscribe. The next revelation might be closer than you think.